All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, 1923, the voters, the people of Cincinnati, vote on an ordinance that would limit the speed of cars in their city to 25 miles per hour. This vote was taking place amidst a big conversation about the introduction and the arrival of the automobile in American cities, and votes like this were kind of taking place all around the country. The car lobby, no surprise, was mobilized, looking to defeat efforts to curb or limit the car use in cities. Part of this process was something that also happened in Cincinnati around the same time, the passage of the first laws around jaywalking. And all of a sudden, pedestrians had to cede to cars. They had to look both ways. And what we see is that the laws and the culture were starting to tilt towards the automobile. A message was starting to be sent about who really the roads in cities belong to. So let's talk about this fight in Cincinnati and the larger fights around the country and speed limits and all this and jaywalking and all this stuff. Here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Doug Gordon, Safe Streets advocate and co-host of the War on Cars podcast, one of three hosts for that. I think we've shouted out your podcast on our show before, but Doug, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to finally have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So we'll talk a lot about how both the legacy of this continues today and then how some of these fights are still playing out today. But let's go to Cincinnati in 1923. One interesting that happens, Doug, is, we should say this vote that we're hooking it to, the people of Cincinnati ultimately opposed the ordinance to limit car speed. But it was even put on the books and put up to a vote because there was a big petition that 42,000 residents of Cincinnati signed saying, you know what? We should limit the speed of cars to 25 miles per hour. Is it fair to characterize a sort of populist hesitation about fast cars moving through cities in this moment?
Well, when cars first arrived on the scene in, the 1910s, let's say, they were seen as intruders, as invaders in cities. And you were able to cross the street wherever you wanted to. The street was a place for commerce, for socialization. It wasn't a place for storing and moving cars. And so when cars started to show up, they started killing a lot of people. And there was this revulsion against cars. Cars were expensive. They were seen as playthings for the rich. So you had, wealthy white playboys going through town on pleasure rides and just mowing down children. And that led to this kind of popular uprising against automobiles.
I mean, it has all of the makings of a populist uprising. Wealthy white guys killing children. It's a wonder that it actually takes regulation to make them stop doing it. It seems like the most Montgomery Burns kind of thing possible that you could do.
I mean, I think what blows my mind the most is that the leading cause of death in 1925 is automobiles. I mean, over 200,000 Americans were being killed every year by a car. That's just astounding to me. And the fact that there are not a whole lot of protections put into the system to help out pedestrians.
We talk a lot on our podcast about how cars were the original move fast and break things technology. They were, and in a very literal sense, they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the speed thing, I mean, so, it strikes me because it feels like when we talk about regulating cars, now not to bring us too much to the present, but when we talk about, regulating cars and sort of traffic fatalities and so forth, putting a limit on how fast cars can go doesn't always enter the conversation. I mean, I know there's a lot of advocacy around that going on now, but it is kind of the most obvious thing, right? And it is interesting to me that when there was this populist pushback, the first move was not, oh, well, let's redesign our streets or let's do a safety campaign or whatever. It was really like, well, these things go fast. They break things, so maybe they shouldn't go as fast.
Slow them down, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, cars are really an aberration in terms of speed when you think about it. The fact that, today cars can go hundreds of miles an hour, and back then going 25, 35, 50 miles an hour when the top speed of a horse was, 15, a cyclist, maybe 15 as well. And the walking speed of most humans is 2 to 3 miles an hour. So it was really a shock to the human system of streets.
Yeah.
It must have really changed the feel of cities to suddenly have these very fast-moving vehicles claiming the streets. And it makes a lot of sense that 42,000 people would sign a petition to slow them down. What I find so fascinating is ultimately, they have this opportunity to vote on this referendum to make cars go slower. And even though more than 40,000 people signed the petition, just like 11,000 actually vote for it to happen. And I think that the campaign against it is a pretty interesting phenomenon.
Right. So the 1923 vote, only about 14,000 voters supported it, 92,000 opposed. So it's a pretty broad and big split right there. Opposed one in a landslide. But this wasn't like a natural occurrence. There was a lot of lobbying going on. The automobile associations really saw this as a threat to their sales. Car sales actually were going down at a certain point because of this revulsion against cars, because of the popular uprising. There were cities like Baltimore that erected memorials to dead children, stuff that looked like a World War I memorial that you might see, an obelisk or something like that with the names of victims on it. And so, this referendum essentially just went down in flames. And it was because of massive lobbying on the part of auto dealers. They contacted every car owner in the city and said, go vote against this. They had a massive lobbying arm that did this.
Yeah, and you read the list of groups that were lining up and opposed and donating money towards the Citizens Campaign Committee that got organized to oppose this measure. And it's, you could probably guess what they are. Right? It's the Chamber of Commerce, the Businessmen's Club, the Central Labor Council. Realtors were afraid that, this will drop property prices. There's some of the advertisements that were put out to vote no against this. And one of them reads, "Don't help build a Chinese wall around Cincinnati," which, I don't know what the, racial politics of that are. But don't help build a Chinese wall around Cincinnati. Vote no on the petition, basically arguing that this is going to keep people from coming into our city. No tourists are going to want to come in. People are going to have to take this big detour around the city. So, it was an effective mobilization. But our cities were actively designed, right? And so, how active was the car industry in sort of redefining the streets in this era?
They were hugely active in this. You can look at old pictures of New York City, Lexington Avenue, and you can see sidewalks that are 5 or 6 feet wider than they are today.
Wow.
They just started eroding, basically, parts of cities. Grand Army Plaza, near where I live here in Brooklyn, was designed to be connected to Prospect Park, Brooklyn Central Park. And today it's just this little island in a sea of asphalt. And that happened in, some people's lifetimes today. It happened in the 1920s, 1930s. And it slowly got worse and then very quickly got worse over time.
I mean, I guess I know we've talked about this before in previous episodes. We don't necessarily think about what goes into urban planning. When we think of a city or when we think of a space, we don't think, you think buildings, sure, or streets, but you don't necessarily think sidewalks. You don't necessarily think green space or spaces that people would need in order just to congregate or have a social space. There weren't really, until much later, parks. Cemeteries were actually used as the first parks. So when you think about this idea of how you configure space for people to interact, cars really do complicate that notion because the technology is so far ahead of where people are on the ground.
And cars are hungry. They take a lot of space. They demand a lot of... They're arrogant, right? They take up a lot of our attention. And, I think they're sort of like the original mansplainers or manspreaders, right? They just sort of like occupy a lot of space that they don't really deserve because it's just usually one person in them, maybe two. And there's no reason why one or two people should get like an 8 by 6 foot space in the city to just take as theirs.
Doug, you sound like you hate cars.
I think I probably have to do the requisite look, not all cars. I drive myself sometimes. The cars are useful, but they're tools, right?
Yeah.
Like sledgehammers are useful, but if you used it to hang a picture in your house, you'd probably have a lot of holes in the wall. And that's sort of how I feel about cars in cities, right? They're kind of the sledgehammer. And sometimes all you need is like, I don't know, tiny little pair of tweezers. And so that's how I feel about like bikes and things like that. They're the appropriate tool for the job. Cars are not always the appropriate tool for the job.
Well, and to that point, I mean, I do think what we're also painting a picture of here is just a sort of larger cultural deference to the car. And I think a big example of that is, as I mentioned in the intro, the introduction of these jaywalking laws. And I want to talk about them as laws, but I also want to start talking about them as a sort of cultural phenomenon, because the origin of the phrase jaywalking, right? A jay was like a hick or a rube, right? There's someone who comes from outside of the city, doesn't know the city ways. And so jaywalking is this cultural designation that basically like, you can't hang it in a city. You don't know how to deal with these cars. Look at you rube. And there's so much in there about kind of like who matters more, this person or this vehicle, this object.
And there was this whole campaign to create a kind of social stigma that you're describing, Jody, around jaywalking, to reverse the responsibility for keeping people safe, right? You see these early attempts to try to slow down cars, and they get replaced with this idea that you're responsible for your own safety. And if you're not taking care of that safety, if you get hit by a car, it's your own fault. And the idea that this wasn't just about passing laws and creating new regulations on where people can walk, but it was actually about like making people feel foolish for jaywalking, using some of the new sort of propaganda materials that were being refined during like World War I and ultimately in World War II, right? That you put up posters and put out signs that make fun of jaywalkers is such an interesting way of inventing a new crime and regulating it not just through the police, but through society.
My favorite part of this history is the use of the Boy Scouts in popularizing the concept of jaywalking, because what's more respectable, right, than like little boys in uniform, just pledging to do good and, have honor. They would hand out pamphlets from automobile associations and civic organizations telling people what the rules were. And, we think today about all the campaigns leveled at children, cross at the green and not in between, look both ways before you cross the street. This was a reverse of that. This was children educating adults to a pretty nefarious outcome in the end. But the use of the Boy Scouts is a really huge part of this history that's often unmentioned.
I mean, all of this is just so like fascinating to me because I feel like, when you think about crime, it's such a social construction in terms of what we delineate as something that's a problem. But oftentimes it's not the people that we prioritize, but it's the technology or it's the product that we put at the center. And then we have people sort of navigate around that. And it just seems so backward to me that you wouldn't prioritize people first and then have products function around humanity.
It feels like Just Say No in some weird way in the way that we're talking about this. It feels a little bit like, oh, it's on you, right? And it's a failing on your part if you succumb to this or if you let this get the better of you. And, in a similar way, like I think I'm of a generation where like I got Just Say No was drilled into me, and like jaywalking was too, like this idea. And I'm, just sort of, I think I've only recently started to really rethink it, but like this idea that it was like the worst thing in the world to cross a street. not at a corner, and not just because a car might hit you thing, but because it was like some cultural violation or whatever.
And it all happened in such a short amount of time, because sort of like we were talking about earlier, 1910s, early 1920s, there were mobs of people who would pull drivers out of their cars after they ran over a child and like vigilante style beat them up before the police could arrive. And today, when you think about what happens if a child is hit by a driver, it's often the first reaction from even the police, from the media, from everybody is, well, what was the child doing? They darted out into traffic. They weren't holding the parent's hand. And never a question of, was the driver looking at the phone or looking at their phone or speeding or anything like that. So, and we're talking about that change happening in the span of like 10 to 15 years, 20 years tops.
Interesting.
Are these social norms, do they vary from city to city? Because as someone who lived in New York for a while, I jaywalked all the time. Like, all the time. But then you go to like smaller cities and people are like, get out the street. Like, I think there's much more of a decorum in places where the expectation is, hey, you follow the rules. Where I feel like in New York, that's sort of like everybody's a maverick, right? Everybody's just walking into the street, getting where they need to go, cutting across. If it's clear, it's fine. There are different ways, I think, with that we, I don't know, maybe sort of fudge the rules a little bit, depending on where you live. Is that just me? Am I the only one that like jaywalked all the time and was like, this is what New Yorkers do?
There's a really fun little stat. I don't know the exact numbers, but traffic planners will often measure how long it takes for pedestrians to start walking after they get the signal. 1 second, 2 second, that reaction time. When you look, you see it, and then you walk. New Yorkers have like a negative reaction. They usually start walking before the signal changes. Like as soon as it's clear, we go. So there's definitely something cultural to it, because you go to other countries and sometimes they're a little more rule bound perhaps than we are. But then there are other countries where all bets are off. So it just varies.
I've noticed this in Washington, D.C., that folks are much more likely to obey the signals. And I think part of it is that the speed limit seems a little higher, like the roads seem a little wider, and it seems like you're taking your life in your hands a little bit more when you cross against the light there.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's not to at all minimize sort of the problem of cars in a lot of New York City neighborhoods, but I do think at some deep level in certain parts of New York, people know that like cars just aren't going as fast, right? And I think that's the sort of what we're painting a picture here is like we all are negotiating this space together, and so in certain places, not under the BQE or whatever, where cars are going to go really fast, and New Yorkers get super like cautious about that, but on neighborhood streets, it's what we were describing here. It's what Cincinnati was trying to do. Like, let's just make these things not go that fast. You kind of know they're not going to be going that fast. That doesn't mean you're going to be reckless, but at some level, it does change the
and to tie it back to the idea of speed governors in cars, so in Cincinnati, they were saying, let's limit the speed of cars to about 25 miles an hour. We have speed-limited, speed-governed vehicles in a lot of American cities. They're just the little electric scooters that you can find people sharing, and they're speed-governed at about 15 miles an hour. Unfortunately, we have the technology to govern speed-governed cars better than we've ever had with GPS that could match the speed limit on a street that you're traveling down at that very moment. You could be governed to 25 miles an hour in New York and 55 or 65 when you're on I-95. But we just don't do it because the political will has shifted so much from this period that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, one other question sort of on the laws, and I guess to now too, and I guess in a way, I mentioned the drug war, but we've decriminalized a lot of drugs. Are there places that are decriminalizing jaywalking?
Yeah, the state of California just did this. They it's not technically legal, but they have decriminalized it. And there are other places that are looking to do this. In New York, it is illegal. It is rarely enforced. Yeah. Jaywalking is rarely enforced. Unfortunately, when it is enforced, it's basically enforced against Black and Hispanic people. And I think there's like a very, very tiny number of jaywalking tickets that are written, but something like 99% of them go to people of color.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, it's some huge,
That's wild. I have a little fun fact. When I think about jaywalking, I think about Tupac, the rapper Tupac Shakur, and how he was in Oakland. And he often talked about being harassed by the police. But on this one particular day, he was jaywalking and the police stopped him, harassed him, put him in a chokehold, actually. And he sued the Oakland Police Department for $10 million. He won 42,000, but it's a heck of a price to pay for jaywalking. But it's just, again, some of this, when you take it out to the extreme, it becomes a little ridiculous that this is the result of walking across the street against the light.
It was such an important component of that kind of broken windows policing that somebody like Rudy Giuliani, when he was mayor, was enforcing. And it's not a coincidence that it had these deeply racialized outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have the numbers for if you want for New York. It's kind of weird. So this is from 2019. There were only 397 jaywalking tickets written in the entire city, where over 8 million people, and only 397 jaywalking tickets were written. But tickets to Black and Hispanic people, 354. So almost 90%.
Jeez.
And more than half of those numbers were people 25 and under. So it's basically like Black youth who are being targeted. And it's a pretextual stop, right? It's they're not being stopped because they're jaywalking. They're being stopped for some other reason, and jaywalking is the first reason to pull them over, basically.
So as we wrap up, I'm just curious. Well, first off, you don't happen to know what's Cincinnati like these days? Do you happen to know? Do you have your ranking in your head of pedestrian-friendly cities or car-unfriendly cities?
Cincinnati is a really great city, and they have a lot of like old, nice, historic, walkable neighborhoods, and they do a really good job in those places. But Cincinnati, like a lot of American cities, was just like blitzed with highways from the 1930s all the way to the 1960s and 70s. Highways bulldozed through largely Black neighborhoods, segregating neighborhoods and communities. And so, there are lots of great walkable cities, but lots of our cities used to be more walkable because they didn't have as many cars in them.
Yeah. And so then I guess on that point, do you want to highlight any cities that feel like they're doing a particularly good job, and even especially like cities that maybe have had some of this? We started on this note of populism, right? And so are there any cities that have felt like the people are starting to ask some real questions about how car-centric they are?
Well, I mean, I think here in New York, we're a walkers city first, and we have the Vision Zero program, which was started under Mayor Bill de Blasio. There's debates about how successful it has been, and I have my own sort of opinions on that. But at the advocacy level, at the citizen level, really to kind of relate it to Cincinnati in the 1920s, there is this feeling like that something must be done. San Francisco has a lot of that going on right now. Even in very car-centric places like Atlanta, there's just an incredible advocacy community that's really kind of working to bring these issues up. Syracuse, New York, is bringing down a highway that divided a neighborhood, and there's talk of doing something similar in Milwaukee and restitching neighborhoods together. So I do think these issues, especially as climate change and the link between automobiles and climate change becomes, more than obvious, lots of people are connecting automobiles to other problems of social justice, of public health as well. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff happening in lots of cities all over the country.
Yeah, and I think it's also like the lever on cars is coming down at the same time that the lever on what are all the other things that a street can be is going up, right? And the rise of biking, the rise of open streets for restaurants and kids playing and so forth. And so I think those are connected. Is this a real? Is this a question you will understand? Let me see. Which one of those feels like more like the one that's going to lead to actual change? A war on cars, or more promoting other alternatives that will naturally push cars off to the side?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about here is that there isn't really a war on cars. Cars have been waging a war on people for about 100 years. And people are starting to understand that the pandemic accelerated this with, open streets, like you said, and outdoor dining, that we can use our streets for better, higher goods. We can use them for, instead of 2 or 3 people taking parking, 20 or 30 people can sit in that same space and enjoy a meal at a restaurant and provide tax revenue to the city that car or those cars never could. So I don't think there's any one thing that's going to kind of lead to the populist uprising, down with cars. We'll all be out with our torches, like Simpsons characters going after Mr. Burns, right? But I think that there's going to be a lot of stuff. We see the rise of bike share in every city where people said no one's ever going to bike here, and then bike share kicks off and everyone's biking. So I think it's happening all over the globe too.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Doug Gordon, the podcast is War on Cars, and it's how many episodes do you do a month?
We do about 2 episodes a month and 1 bonus usually.
All right. So go check that out. But Doug, thank you so much for doing this.
This was awesome. Thank you all.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia.